Thanks to British Academy and to Lord O'Donnell, to Gus, and to Bonnie for helping put this together. It's really a great opportunity for me. This is a different audience than I usually speak to, and this book was written for this audience. I saw the listing of the kinds of people who are here, and they're exactly the kinds of people whom I want to reach. So let me go through obviously can't go through everything, so I'm going to set out some large themes and then talk about some specifics that I think are particularly important in the time that I have available. The broad themes, this first sentence may seem self-evident. Society should face up to the uncertainties that attend policy formation. I think we all understand that making policy is difficult, trying to forecast the consequences is hard, and we should just face up to that. You would think that that would be self-evident and wouldn't even need stating. However, unfortunately, what I found, and I think this is a prevalent view, is that the current practice of policy analysis hides uncertainty rather than putting it up front. And this bothers me quite a lot, and this is what I want to talk about. It's a question of how that happens. It could be that researchers simply make stuff up, lie or just make mistakes, but that's not really the way it happens in most of the time. The way it happens most of the time is that the research that's done is perfectly logical internally, but that the data that you have available only get you so far, and you have to combine them with assumptions or theory, hypotheses, whatever you want to call them. And people make strong assumptions in order to get strong results. And those strong assumptions may not be justifiable or tenable, and that's the basic issue. So what I've been arguing for quite a long time in my formal work in econometrics is that credible policy analysis would explicitly express the limits to knowledge and be upfront about what we do know and don't know. And then we would face our policy decisions from that perspective. Then the question is, if you do face up to it, then how do you actually make decisions when you acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainty in the world? And so I discussed that at some length. It's a very hard problem, and I don't have a full answer. I don't think anybody does, but I discussed this at some length in the book. So let me talk Andrew said I've written several books, lots and lots of journal articles. So why did I particularly write this book? So I typically write in math for an audience of academic economists and policy analysis. Actually, CMAP, which Andrew directs, is kind of a wonderful institution for people like myself. I've been coming to London annually, almost every March for the last 10, 12 years, spending a few weeks here and lecturing to PhD students and faculty. And Andrew is a tough taskmaster. On Monday or Tuesday of this week, I lectured 4.5 hours each day to what was called a master class of CMAP. And of course, I enjoy doing that. But this book is different. I've written this book in English. Now, it's true it's written in American English, but it's still a form of English. And which is actually, for someone like myself, it's much harder than writing in math with a little bit of English around it, because I didn't want this to be a pop science book. I wanted it to be completely serious, and to do that in words without the ability to say things mathematically is actually hard sometimes. But I've done the best I can, and what I wanted to reach out to were policymakers, civil servants, journalists, and policy students who may not have should not be expected to have the technical background that PhD economists do. And, well, why do this? If you think about the way policy analysis and decision-making is performed, in the UK, in the US, I think in all modern societies, there's a strong institutional separation between the analysis and the decision-making. We have analysts, researchers who do the work, and then they report their findings to policymakers. And the institutional separation makes perfect sense from a perspective of division of labor. No one can be expert on everything, so you have to rely on people with if you're a policymaker, you really need to rely on the expertise of the analyst to help you out. The problem, though, is that the current practice of policy analysis does not serve the public well. At least that's the conclusion that I've reached. And to be somewhat brutal about it, what I write in the book, and it's up here on the slide, the consumers of policy analysis cannot trust the producers. What I'm saying by that is that people, I mean, there's a lot of civil servants in this audience that's looking at the list. You may be the consumers of research that's coming, from economists and other social scientists, and I'm here to tell you that you should be skeptical of what's reported to you, which is not going to, makes me some enemies, but okay. So what the book is about is to explain how policy analysis is performed and to suggest how it can better inform policy making, at least to the extent that I can. The contents, the book's divided up into two parts. The first part is about policy analysis. It's trying to describe how it's done currently and how I think it should be done. And then the second part is about the implications for decision making. And I want to speak about some of each of these this evening. I obviously can't get into everything, but I'll try to pick out some particular topics that I think are particularly important. So that's what I'm going to go on and do now. What I begin with is the first chapter is called Policy Analysis with Incredible Certitude. And certitude, of course, means people present their results as if they're sure of them, but those results may not have much credibility. So that's incredible certitude. So let me, I have here, it's like if you call it a mathematical relationship, I'm not sure, in bold, assumptions plus data imply conclusions. That's about as mathematical as the book gets. And it's obvious, it's trivial, but it's fundamental. And we have to put data together with assumptions to draw conclusions. The reason why I really focus on this heavily, and I keep even repeating it to myself, not just to students and other people, is that we tend to think that what science does is it brings to bear data. And there's a lot of discussion of evidence-based policy making. And so you stress the evidence, that's the data. But what's often forgotten is that the data, the evidence alone, never gets you, doesn't do it. You always have to combine the data with assumptions or theory, because we're always trying to extrapolate from what we can see in the data to predict what would happen in counterfactual situations, and that requires the assumptions. And the unfortunate thing about the way research is done, the assumptions often get hidden. They're often stated in a technical and a mathematical way. You have to know the jargon. When someone's if you're a consultant and you're making a report to the policymaker, you don't want to bother the policymaker with all that, boring technical stuff, so you get right to the results. But the assumptions are critical. And kind of a key message throughout the entire book is that if you're a consumer, if someone's reporting results to you, the very first thing you should be asking is, well, what assumptions did you use to get to that result? So it's the assumptions plus the data implies the conclusions. And I mentioned counterfactuals. There are many reasons why it's difficult to predict policy outcomes. I think there's very widespread agreement among social scientists that the unobservability of counterfactual outcomes is perhaps the central, most fundamental problem. And this is for which assumptions are critical. The data that you have are the outcomes that are realized under some status quo policy. Okay, that we observe what happens under the policy that's actually in place. What policy analysis is about is it's not a form of history just to see what happened in the past. What policy analysis is always about is to take the data on existing policies and use it to forecast what would happen under alternative policies. The problem is the alternative policies are not in place. They're counterfactuals. We don't know what would happen under the other policies. So since the evidence or the data alone don't suffice, it requires assumptions to predict what would happen under alternative policies. And this is a problem of logic. There's no way, getting richer data can always help, but there is still always a fundamental problem that you don't know what would happen under some policy that hasn't been tried yet. So this is not a problem that's resolvable purely by new data collection, although new data collection can be helpful. So when you look at this formally, this kind of issue, and this is what I've been doing in my technical research going back to the late 1980s onwards through today, and you say, well, what kinds of conclusions can given the data that's typically available, what kind of conclusions can one draw about policy outcomes from new policies if I make weak assumptions? Then they don't tend to be exact predictions. They generically tend to be what you might call bounds or ranges or intervals or sets, whatever term you want to use, is that you can't pin things down exactly, is that you can learn, may be able to learn something, but you can't pin things down exactly. And if you make weak assumptions, you draw weak conclusions. And if you make stronger assumptions, then you can draw stronger conclusions, which are actually tightening of the intervals. And then if you make strong enough assumptions, then you can get exact predictions, what we call point estimates, which is what's routinely reported in applied literature. And then the question comes up, so, well, that's okay, that's the way it is. If you want to draw strong conclusions, then we're going to need to make strong assumptions. So then it seems, well, we should all just make strong assumptions because it's nice to have strong conclusions, so let's just make strong assumptions. But then the issue, of course, that arises is the credibility of those assumptions. And there's an inherent tension between the strength of assumptions and their credibility. Back 10 years ago, in a rather technical book that I wrote called, a very different title than this one, Partial Identification of Probability Distributions, written for mathematical statisticians, on the very first page, I wrote down, this is in English, not in math, the law of decreasing credibility, which I invented. It says the credibility of inference decreases with the strength of the assumptions maintained. And it was just meant to be a little reminder that you don't get something for nothing. That if you want to draw strong conclusions, it requires strong assumptions, and then you've got to ask, but do you believe those assumptions? Okay? So the credibility of the assumptions that are used in research is absolutely key. And I'm, by far, not the only one who stresses the credibility of assumptions. There's been, I think, a very widespread movement among economists and other social scientists to worry about the credibility of assumptions over the past 20, 25 years. It's that's led to so much interest recently in performance of randomized experiments, to just take one example. So I use this word credibility. Well, what does it mean? It's actually a tough question. I used it all, the word credibility, like once a paragraph, it seems, and other people I know do similarly. But how do you actually define credibility? Someone badgered me about this at a seminar once, so I couldn't do it, so I thought I'd go to the ultimate authority, which is the Oxford English Dictionary. So here is what the OED says about credibility. You can read it up here. I'll just go through it. The OED defines credibility as the quality of being credible. Okay, that's not very helpful. So I go to credible in the OED, and it defines that as capable of being believed, believable. So I went to believable, and it says able to be believed, credible, and then I stopped. I thought I had gone as far as I could. So the OED couldn't define credibility, and really, it's a kind of a primitive. We understand it, but I'm not going to be able to give you a deep definition. Whatever credibility is, it's subjective. Each of us has our own views about what's a credible assumption or theory or hypothesis. And this becomes critical in all research, and not just social science research. In physical science, biological science research as well, issues of credibility of assumption. Even the theory of evolution, the credibility of the theory is an issue. In basic physics, similarly. The issue is, which is particularly difficult for public policy, is that when it comes to social science topics, people often disagree about the credibility of assumptions. And then you say, well, okay, if people disagree, then we should be able to test the assumptions. There's a whole statistical field of hypothesis testing, which is about testing assumptions. The problem is, and this is a kind of dirty secret of statistics textbooks, is that the only hypotheses you ever see in a statistics textbook are ones that are testable, or refutable is the word I use here. And when you actually do policy analysis or other research, you find out that some of the most important assumptions are simply not testable or refutable. And what that means is that there may be multiple hypotheses that are consistent with the data, and the data just can't tell you which one is right. The reason why this becomes particularly problematic for policy analysis is that an advocate, someone who wants something done, can stake out a position and say, well, my policy is right under this assumption, And then someone else will say, well, I don't believe your assumption. And then the advocate can say, well, I'm going to maintain this assumption until you prove it wrong. And the advocate may well know that there is no way to prove the assumption wrong. Well, then an advocate for the opposing position comes along with a different assumption and reaches a different conclusion, and then what do? All they can do is debate with each other, because neither one can prove each other wrong. And of course, that's what we observe in policy. My own familiar, I spent some time here in Britain, and I know some of what goes on here. Most of my familiarities with the American context, where everything seems to degenerate into a debate. And these debates can just continue forever because neither side can prove the other one wrong. So what can we do about this? So we could provide some incentives. Research doesn't have to be performed this way, but the way the research is performed is to act in the way I just described. What I've been recommending is that research be done in a different way. What I've been recommending is that researchers resolve the tension between the credibility and the power of assumptions by posing assumptions of varying strength and determining the conclusions from different assumptions. So what I mean by that is, if you read a typical research article, the researcher stakes out their favorite assumptions, produces their results, and says, these are my results. When I write an article, I usually set out a menu of different assumptions, some weaker assumptions, some stronger assumptions, and then produce a whole set of empirical results, and then say to the reader, well, I'm not sure which assumption is correct. Maybe just the weaker ones, maybe the stronger ones, but I'm going to give you a set of research results, and then you can pick and choose which one you think is interesting. Rather than a take it or leave it, here are my assumptions, here are my conclusions. That's the way I like to see research done when I do my own empirical work these days. That's the way I do it. But I'm in a very distinct minority. There are people who do it the way I'm saying, but it's a distinct minority. Clearly, the prevalent practice is to sacrifice credibility in return for strong assumptions. So the question is why? So I'm an economist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not any other kind of behavioral scientist. So I can only sort of observe what I think is going on is that policy analysts respond to incentives, which is something you'd expect any economist to say. And what are the incentives? First, from the scientific community, that the community rewards strong, novel findings. If you do an excellent piece of research and the results turn out to be that you really can't say so much about the topic, even though you've done your best, the problem is that it's hard to get that published. And people commiserate among my colleagues. We talk about this all the time, that the journal editors and referees should evaluate research by, was this well done, and did they do the best available to get credible results with what's possible. But the fact is, those kinds of articles have trouble getting published. So there are incentives to stick your neck out and produce strong findings. And similarly from the public. The public wants unequivocal policy recommendations. And so these incentives make it tempting for researchers to maintain assumptions far stronger than they can defend in order to draw strong conclusions. Now, I have a couple of anecdotes about this. The first may be just an apocryphal story. I'm still not certain, but it's a nice one. The second I heard firsthand. The story is about US President Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, that he's at a meeting with some of his economic advisors, and he asked one of them for a forecast. Maybe it was for GDP forecast or something like that. And the advisor gives him a range and says something like, well, I think GDP, we think GDP may grow between 2 and 4% in the year ahead. Johnson, who was a Texan, that's important, is said to have replied, ranges are for cattle, give me a number, okay? So he just didn't want to hear about any uncertainty. So it sounds like Johnson, whether he actually said it or not, it sounds like Johnson. The second story is I heard firsthand, and I think actually, I'm not sure, I think Richard may have been in that audience 25 years ago, is an econometrics colleague who frequently acts as a consultant. And he put it this way, if you're a consultant, you can't give the client a bound, the client needs a point. And that was the statement. And I think that was his, from his experience, that was his view, is that clients of consultants want exact forecasts. They don't want to hear about uncertainty. The question is, and let's say that's right. that often clients don't want to hear about uncertainty. Why is that the case? The argument that I've heard made, and this is a loose argument, I have not seen any formal research on this, but it's an argument that I've heard made repeatedly, is that policymakers, and this is a huge stereotype to talk about all policymakers, but that's, to stereotype that policymakers are either psychologically unwilling or cognitively unable to cope with uncertainty. That's quite a slam and a broad brush. And so then consultants argue that pragmatism dictates point prediction, even though it may not be credible. What are you going to do? They don't want to hear about the uncertainty, so what are you going to do? Interestingly, this argument that you need to pick out and give one point is not just from consultants to policymakers. This has deep roots in philosophy of science. This is an old problem in philosophy of science about what do you do if there are multiple explanations for a given amount of evidence. And there's this old idea, which colloquially, people talk about Occam's razor, it's the medieval tenet, that, well, if there's multiple explanations that are consistent with the data, you should pick one out, and that should be the one that is the most simple. That's the Occam's razor. Well, first of all, it's very hard to define simplicity, about as hard as it is to define credibility, actually. But second, why should you do that? Why in philosophy of science should you pick out one theory among many if they're all consistent with the data? I actually don't understand this, but that's a very old position in philosophy of science. I'm going to go on and talk about some manifestations of this incredible certitude that I don't like. The first chapter of the book sets out a typology of these types of incredible certitude and gives a kind of a case study of each one. I obviously don't have the time to go through all of these, but I'm going to list them all, sort of tell you what I talk about in that chapter, and then I do want to talk at length about one and actually about another one that isn't even in the book that I've been working on recently. So the first one, which I will talk about, is conventional certitudes. These are basically conventional wisdoms, predictions that are generally accepted as true, but that are not necessarily true. And the cases, which I will talk about more in a few minutes, are CBO scorings, Congressional Budget Office forecasting of budgetary impact of legislation in the U.S., and then also reporting of official statistics like unemployment rates and so on. So I'll talk more about that. Dueling certitudes, I think anyone who's around any capital city knows about this, whether it's London or Washington, is that you have different research groups who do different kinds of analysis, come up with diametrically opposing conclusions, and then just argue with each other. And neither one can prove the other one wrong for the reasons I gave before. In the book, I talk about two studies of drug control policy in the United States that were done in the 1990s, one by the RAND Corporation and one by the Institute for Defense Analysis. I got to know these very well because I chaired a National Research Council committee on illegal drug policy, where we were asked to adjudicate between these two studies. Because the RAND study was saying that drug treatment is the way to go and the federal government should be putting lots of money into that. And the IDA study, funded by the Defense Department, was saying that no, we need to be operating in Colombia and the Caribbean and interdicting drug supplies and so on. So, and they were just at each other's throat. There were congressional hearings on this, and it was a kind of typical thing that happens. I'd love to talk more about it, but don't have the time. Conflating science and advocacy. That's very interesting. It's the reversal of the direction of the logical relation. I wrote that assumptions plus data imply conclusions, but you can reverse the logic. You can start out as an advocate and say, here are some conclusions that I want to draw. This is the policy I want, and here's the data available. Now let me think up some assumptions which will justify this. Yeah, I see a lot of people shaking their heads in this audience. You may have familiarity with this more than I do, actually. But this is a very, unfortunately, I think it's a very common thing, is that people write stuff up as if it's scientific method, going from assumptions plus data to conclusions. But the logic that's used is actually the opposite, is they want to get someplace and then you cook a theory that gets you there. My example of this was of a I was going to say, a prima donna of this kind of thing, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, who's a wonderful, superb economist, was also an incredibly effective advocate for his positions. And in the 1950s, he began to advocate strongly for the use of school vouchers as a replacement for government-supported public education. And if you look at what he wrote, I went back and read what he wrote, there's some economic theory in it, but you just know when you read it. You know where he was going, and the way he set up the theory was to get to that conclusion. And, so Friedman was just very effective at doing this. Fourth type of incredible certitude is a very mundane one, is wishful extrapolation. We have to extrapolate from the data to counterfactual policies, so wishful extrapolation is just using untenable assumptions to do that. The example that I go through in the book is a very important one. I use the American context, but the same thing would happen here or throughout the EU. Is drug approval by the Food and Drug Administration. Now, the Food and Drug Administration requires performance of randomized clinical trials. And so you think, well, that's good. The problem is that the clinical trials that are performed are, first of all, on volunteers, who may be very different than general patient populations. And second, they're done double-blind, which is not the way things happen in practice. If your physician writes you a prescription, you hopefully know you are getting penicillin and not just penicillin with probability 0.5, which is what happens in a clinical trial. And then a variety of other reasons why what happens in the clinical trials is different from what happens in actual clinical practice. So the wording that's sometimes used to describe this problem is to worry about the external validity of the randomized trials, and sometimes there isn't much reason for it. Finally, in terms of research, just sometimes people do make mistakes. There are deductive errors. The example that I use in this book actually begins in London in the 1860s and 70s. It's the long history of research on heritability. This is the research on the effect of genes and environment on various social outcomes. And particularly the deductive error is that often results on the so-called relative importance of genes and environment on aptitude scores or wages and so on, is used to draw policy conclusions. And if you actually look at the technical work that's done, you can't draw those policy conclusions. So this was recognized 40 years ago, but sometimes it's forgotten, so there's a good case study there. Final thing I talk about is not to blame us, the researchers, but rather the communication of the research. The media plays an extremely important role in transferring research results from the technical researchers to the policymakers and to the general public. Obviously, there are serious research journalists who try to get it right, but the incentives that the media operates under are like the ones that the researchers operate under. Is just all this incentive to hype research, gets results out early. The case study I use on this is one that particularly bothered me. It was just 2 years ago, a front page article in the New York Times on the case for $320,000 kindergarten teachers. It was on research asserting that having good kindergarten teachers would lead to good outcomes as adults. It may actually be correct. I'm not arguing the substance on this. The overreach, the media overreach, was how this was done. Is that this front page of the New York Times? Not easy to get on the front page of the New York Times. It was based on one conference presentation and one bullet point on one slide off of a paper that did not even exist at the time. So that was kind of real media overreach. And I want to go on and talk about a couple of these things in a little more detail. Maybe spend about 10 minutes on this, and then I'll take the remaining 15 or so on policy making. CBO scoring of legislation. So I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with the CBO. It's become an important American institution. Established in 1974, whenever legislation is before Congress, the CBO is required to produce a 10-year out forecast of the budgetary implications of the legislation. And these are called scores. And they're done as point predictions without expression of any uncertainty whatsoever. And they are, the reason I call them a conventional certitude is because the CBO scores are accepted widely. Even though Democrats and Republicans agree on almost nothing, they do somehow agree on the CBO scores. These numbers come out and people seem to take them seriously. They get reported in the media and no one questions them. So it's become a conventional certitude. The case study that I looked at, which is very interesting, You may not know the formal legislation called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, but if I said Obamacare, everyone would know that, because that's what everyone now calls it, including President Obama himself, is Obamacare. And it was very important when that legislation, very major health legislation, was before Congress. Major question was, would it increase or decrease the deficit? And so the CBO had to come up with their score, and the CBO wrote to Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, that the CBO and the JCT, which is the Joint Committee on Taxation, they did this together, that if the legislation were enacted in its current form, it would reduce the deficit by $138 billion over the next 10 years. And the 25-page letter to the Speaker of the House and the Senate leaders made no mention of uncertainty whatsoever. It was just going to reduce the deficit by $138 billion, period. Most people accepted that. Curiously, one person who did not accept that was a former director of the CBO, Douglas Holtz-Eakin. And he wrote, this was an op-ed in the New York Times, which is sort of brutal. He wrote, in reality, if you strip out all the gimmicks and budgetary games and rework the calculus, a wholly different picture emerges. The health care reform legislation would raise, not lower, federal deficits by $562 billion, another sort of precise number. So here you have dueling certitudes. Holtz-Eakin didn't provide any uncertainty either. I thought, well, look, as an economist, I know I'm an econometrician, but I know something about labor economics and health economics and consumer demand and so on. Forecasting what's going to happen in terms of the implications on patient behavior, physician behavior, the health insurers, the hospitals, this is very, very hard. So this $138 billion savings, is that $138 billion plus or minus $1 billion, plus or minus $50 billion, plus or minus $500 billion? What is this? And I don't know, because you don't know how they did this. So I made a simple recommendation that the CBO should maybe provide an interval, an upper and lower bound. There are other ways you could do it. They could provide a probability distribution, but somehow that they should express uncertainty. And I actually gave a political reason for doing this, which is that it seems to me, although people in Washington say that I'm naive about this, but it seems to me that at some time this consensus to accept whatever the CBO says is going to break down if someone gets onto those numbers, and then they're going to lose their reputation, which is very strong now. I thought it's better for the CBO to get in front of this and to be clear and transparent themselves. And so an interval forecast, an upper and lower bound, would be one simple way of doing that. I don't want to take a particular stand that that's the best way, but it's just one way of doing it. The question that kept coming up is, well, can Congress cope with uncertainty? And when I talk to academics about this, they say, yeah, sure, of course they should be expressing uncertainty. I found, this is not a formal empirical analysis, but it seems to me that when I talk to economists, the closer they live to the center of Washington, D.C., the more skeptical they are of saying anything with any uncertainty. And they say, and I won't name names here, but various people who I think are as serious economists, mostly some in academic positions and some in the think tanks around Washington, they assert that members of Congress are psychologically or cognitively unable to deal with uncertainty. That's one argument that's made. There's another argument that's made that I actually find, well, that argument may or may not be correct. The second argument I find actually quite interesting intellectually. They say, look, the idea that being transparent and the CBO telling Congress everything they know, that comes out of the way economists usually think about individual decision-making, that if you have what we call a principal-agent problem, the agent should provide the principal everything he knows. But they say, that's not what Congress is. Congress is a very complex, dynamic political game. And in a dynamic political game, it is possible that providing more information can yield worse outcomes rather than better. In the book, I give an example of this. Gus and I were talking about this before a little bit, about the Rawls veil of ignorance is actually a very interesting example of this, where you can get a better social outcome if people have less information than if people have more information. So there is something serious about this. It's not that there's formal game theory out there that says that that's right, that it's better not to provide full information, but you can imagine it. Now here's the last thing I want to say about this, interesting. 2 years ago, I gave a talk on this front material, just on the incredible certitude at IFS. And And afterwards, a woman who was an analyst at one of the ministries here emailed me and said, you know, you want interval forecasts rather than these point predictions. We do that here. And she sent me the link to the website giving the rules for doing impact assessments for legislation that's presented to Parliament. And I was astonished, actually very sort of pleasantly surprised to see that the rules for doing impact assessments in the UK require the ministry that's presenting the legislation to do a cost-benefit analysis. And it says explicitly, there's wording like, you know, we of course realize that there's uncertainty in forecasting policy impacts. Therefore, we ask you to give both a lower and upper bound and also a point estimate. So that's required here. There's nothing similar in the United States. Okay. You also have the fan charts from the Bank of England and inflation forecasting. So I found that there seems to be more receptivity in Great Britain to being explicit about uncertainty than there is in the US. It's a cultural, since our societies are alike in so many ways, it's a cultural difference that I don't understand. But I find that people seem to listen to me more here than they do in the United States. That's my personal thing. Okay, so but I'd be curious about. I was curious to hear what Gus has to say about that and what your own views are on that. Now, I think for time, I think I'm going to skip the second example I was going to give. It was just to say briefly, when official statistics are put out routinely, like on the unemployment rate or median household income, they're generally put out as point estimates. And there's a huge amount of uncertainty behind any of those official statistics, both for simple things like sampling uncertainty, because they're based on household surveys, but much, I think, even more dominant are the non-sampling sources of uncertainty. The fact that there could be very large amounts of non-response to these surveys, that there may be mismeasurement and all kinds of things. And I went through and looked at the way things go in the US from the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and there's no documentation of the uncertainty. So I have if you're interested in that, this is not actually in this book because it's a paper I just wrote this past fall, but on my webpage there's a working paper on this subject. But I think I want to get on, so I'm not going to take the time to, I'm just going to skip over the slides on this. What I want to take the rest of the time to talk about is about the implications of this for policy making. When I've talked, I've been as I said, I've been doing technical research on these issues for a long time, and often a reaction that I've had is, look, yeah, you're right. There is all this uncertainty, but what are we going to do? We've got to make a decision. And we just don't understand how to make decisions with uncertainty, so we need what people sometimes call assumptions of convenience in order to enable ourselves to make decisions. And I never thought that was a good answer. So I've tried to think about, seriously facing up to uncertainty. And I'll explain, and there are three things, three main points I want to make, and then I want to focus on one of them. It's about the dangers of not facing up to uncertainty. First danger of not facing up to uncertainty and of doing policy analysis with incredible certitude is that you can think you're choosing an optimal policy, and maybe it is an optimal policy, but not for the world that we really live in. It can be an optimal policy for some hypothetical world that obeys the assumptions of your model, but that's not the world that we live in. And if you're an economic theorist, that's fine. The journals publish articles on what would optimal policy be in this or that hypothetical world, and they get published in the leading journals all the time. But if we're thinking about doing serious policy analysis in our world, who are you fooling? To set up economists love to set up optimization problems, is to set up an optimization problem and solve it, but under assumptions that are far removed from reality. So because we want to maximize actual social welfare, not some kind of hypothetical social welfare. So that's one danger. Second danger, which I think is very important, is the implications for learning. If you think that you already know what's good policy, there's no reason to do any new research. Because we already know what's right, so why should we? Research is costly. Why should we do new research? If you face up to the uncertainties that we really have, then you should think about what we might do to learn more. And then new research may involve new data collection. It may involve new methodological work, all the kinds of things that might contribute. But if you say, well, I know everything that I need to know already, then you don't fund research. Now, that may sound self-serving because I'm a researcher and I want research funding, but, I think the point is pretty clear. The third point, and this is the one that I'll spend the rest of the time on, is that if you think about making decisions with full knowledge, as if you have full knowledge, then there are kinds of there are strategies for decision-making that you would never think of using. There are strategies for decision-making that become important only when you face uncertainty and that you would never use if you had full knowledge. Now, I list two here, and I'm going to focus on the second, but I'll mention both. The first is the idea of flexibility. The idea of not committing yourself up front to some long-run policy and instead taking things step by step, trying something out, seeing what happens, and then redoing it, and not getting yourself tied down. If you had complete knowledge, there'd be no purpose for flexibility. But everyone, whether in public policy or in our own personal lives, knows that there are times when having flexibility is a good thing, and that comes purely from incomplete knowledge. The other, this is the one I'm going to focus on, is diversification, okay? And so let me talk about diversification, something you may not think of with regard to policy making. Since the word diversification, I assume everyone here is familiar with, but in a different context, in the context of portfolio allocation and finance, of diversification of your assets. We all knew until the financial crisis, at least, that the right thing to do was to have a diversified portfolio and have some stocks and some bonds and a little bit of cash. And that diversification would, maybe diversification did help, but so when things systemically went wrong in the financial crisis, diversification, wasn't all it was cracked up to be. But still, financial diversification is generally an interesting idea. So we talk about a portfolio as being diversified if an investor allocates positive fractions of wealth to different investments. If you had complete knowledge, as an investor, you would never diversify. You would just put all of your money into the into the investment with the highest return. The rationale for diversification arises purely from incompleteness of knowledge. It enables someone who's uncertain about the returns to investment to balance potential errors. So the idea in the book that I put forward, and I've written technical articles on this, but I think this is the major new, I hope, practical idea, constructive idea that's developed in Chapter 5 in the book, is to think about policy diversification in the same way that we think about portfolio diversification. And in ways it can be a little controversial idea, so let me try to flesh it out. Policy choice would be diversified. Let's imagine, I'll use the word a planner, a social planner, someone who's has the ability to make policy. If the planner were to allocate positive fractions of the population to each of various policies, that would be diversification, in the same way as you do it with assets for the investor. What diversification of policy would enable the planner to do is to kind of balance potential errors. You don't know which policy is right. So we'll subject some people to one policy and some people to another policy, and that's diversifying policy. Now, when can you diversify policy? The range of situations in principle, not necessarily in political practice, but in principle where you could do this to what you might call micro policies. You could have an educational policy where you could put some students in this class size and some students in that class size. Some students are learning this kind of educational theory and some by another educational theory. You have millions of students, so you could do that. You can do it with health policy. The National Health Service here, in cases where you don't know what the best treatment for a disease is, then you could have some patients take this treatment, some patients take that treatment. Formally, it's the same kind of diversification as there is with assets and financial diversification. You could even do it with income tax policy. I'm not saying this is politically feasible, but there's huge uncertainty about the impacts of income tax policy on labor supply and so on. And you could, in principle, I'm not saying necessarily in practice, subject people to different income tax schedules and diversify income tax policy. Now, those are the cases where you can do it. There's some, just I have to be careful, there's some cases where you can't do this. You cannot do this in general with macroeconomic policies. You can't have a diversified monetary policy. I can't have me subject to one monetary policy and Andrew Cheshire subject to another monetary policy. That's just not technically feasible. You can't do it with climate change policy. It affects the entire world. There are a variety of macro-type policies where you cannot diversify, but still many where you can. I want to be clear that diversification of policy differs from profiling. What diversification calls for is randomly different treatment of people. Profiling is the idea, which is also very important, and I don't want to dismiss it in any way, of systematically differing treatment among people who differ in their observed attributes. So if you go to the physician and you're sick, then if you're 65 years old and have this health status, the physician may prescribe this treatment, and if you're 35 years old and in a different health status, then the physician may do something else. That's profiling. And that has nothing to do with uncertainty. That's using information about difference in treatment response across people to make good decisions. Diversification is about doing random variation policy across people rather than systematic. And you can do both, okay, in practice. Now, so I have this notion of diversification, and it's a static notion. Where diversification becomes even more powerful is if you think about it in a sequential or in a dynamic setting, where you can set policy one year and then change policy from year to year. The reason why diversification becomes even more powerful then is that you can put a policy in place 1 year, or 5 years, and whatever the right time period is, diversify it, see what happens, learn. This is the key new thing you can do over time, is learn, and then change the fractions who get each treatment as things learn. And so I developed the idea of adaptive diversification. Diversification, in general, when we think about policy making, I think we should always be thinking about policy making as a dynamic process, where we try a policy out and learn from it, and then have the flexibility, to use that term again, to change our policy as we learn new things. And rather than saying, this is the policy we're going to set for the next 200 years. I think we should always be doing that. Diversification is particularly useful from that perspective because diversification actually generates randomized experiments, which are very helpful for learning. So what I write is that adaptive diversification copes with uncertainty in the short run and reduces it in the long run. I go through an illustration in the book, which I won't go through the details here, but I think where this idea can most easily be implemented is we have some kind of notion of a planner. So for health policy, since you have the NHS, which isn't, it isn't an all-powerful social planner, but it has much more of a social planning aspect to it than the American health system, which is very, very decentralized. So there's a lot that the NHS could do, I think, along these lines. In the US, the military could do it. The military health system could do something of this type. There's an issue, I wish I had more time to, there's an ethical issue which I discuss at some length in the book about, diversification of policy makes people uncomfortable because it violates the ethical notion of equal treatment of equals, which is important in the US, it's important here. The only point, read the book, there's a long discussion about this. The only point I'll make here is that there are two notions of equal treatment of equal, and you need to separate them. There's an ex ante and an ex post notion. The ex ante notion of equal treatment of equals is that, let's say there are two treatments, A and B, and let's say 40% of people are going to get treatment A and 60% get treatment B under this diversification, then everyone has the same 40% chance of getting A and the same 60% chance of getting B. So from an ex ante perspective, this diversification is fine with equal treatment of equals. Where it's not is an ex post, is that ex post, some people are going to get A and some people are going to get B. And there's some interesting issues about this. Our societies actually mostly seem to want ex post equal treatment, but there are a lot of things that we do with ex ante equal treatment. We have random drug testing, random airport screening, and randomized experiments, of course. All of those have ex ante and not ex post equal treatment. The final thing I want to say about this, and then I'll just a couple of concluding remarks, is that the way the book is written, chapters 4 and 5 take this somewhat idealized view of a social planner who can choose policy. And the discussion, and I do this on purpose because I want to focus on the issues of uncertainty, but obviously democracy is much messier than having a social, even if it's a benevolent dictator who's going to make policy for us. So I do discuss some approximations to adaptive diversification that could be implemented easily in a democracy, even more easily than the full social planning view. And one idea that's is very important is the idea of decentralization of policy. This is quite important in the United States. Of course, we have a federal system with 50 states, and the federal government sets some kinds of policies, but there are many things that the states can do. And among legal scholars and political scientists in the United States, the notion of the states as the laboratories of democracy has long been common. I'm not sure whether that phrase is as familiar here as it is in the U.S. That particular phrase, laboratories of democracy, which is that through decentralization, the states can experiment with different policies and try things out, and then we'll all learn what works, right? That particular phrase came from Justice Brandeis in a 1932 Supreme Court case. Actually, 20 years earlier, President Theodore Roosevelt made the same point in a 1912 book. So this goes way back in the American context. UK has a certain amount of decentralization of policy, and so not as much, I think, as we do in the US, but to some extent you could do that. Okay, let me conclude. Analysts today tend to provide exact predictions of policy outcomes, sacrificing credibility. They could provide credible interval predictions or express uncertainty other ways rather than intervals. Some people think this idea impractical or unwise. I've explained that some people say that policymakers are psychologically unwilling or unable to cope with uncertainty, or from this game theoretic perspective that facing up to uncertainty may lead to worse decisions. I can't say I'm sure that facing up to uncertainty would lead to better policy making by our societies. If I were to say, do it my way, I'm sure it's better, then guess what? I would be subject to incredible certitude, because I can't say for sure that if you do things the way I would like, it will lead to better policy decisions. But I do think it's at least worth thinking about. And I think that you can think of the way policy analysis is done now as itself a kind of policy. There's a status quo to the way policy analysis is done. What I'm doing in the book is presenting an innovation, a different way of doing policy analysis. What's the outcome of interest to society is how good are the decisions that we make. And so, well, we should try this innovation somewhere, and maybe we might even diversify. I don't know. This is in the last page of the book. I don't develop it, but I could imagine, at least on some policies, trying to do things the way I would think about doing them. Some policies do it the status quo, and see how each works out, and then we may learn. So that's the kind of conversation that I at least would like to begin, is to head policy making in that direction. Thank you.
It's really good news. The first thing I have to say is buy the book, all right? In a way that the professor was being a bit timid. It's a great book. It's really good value for money because I've now read it twice. And it is the kind of book you will probably want to read more than once. And I think it's crucial because it actually allows you to think about actually what we do every day. And I'll try and go through examples about where the book really hits on things. The first thing is, Professor Mansky is trying to get us to think about the language which we use in thinking about uncertainty and decision-making. I mean, his credible certitude, for example, where he talked about two different positions on a drug testing issue, and both were absolutely clear they were right, and you needed someone to come along and think about what those assumptions were. Now, let me give you a British example. I do this with a heavy heart. Badgers, right? Anyone in the room from DEFRA who's dealt with badgers will know that there is one side that says you have to cull them, and there is another side that says with equal certitude that this will never give you the answer. And in fact, you look at both cases, there is very, very little evidence that backs up either position. In fact, we don't know is the answer. And the interesting thing is we could have started to do some experiments that might have created some data, but we haven't. So I would say the issue about language is very important. The good thing about decision-making under uncertainty, and I know this is very much written by an economist, and the interesting thing about that is that this whole area of decision-making under uncertainty is something that is very, very multidisciplinary. I was at a seminar in UCL called by a psychologist, and we had psychologists, economists, anthropologists, we had experts in artificial intelligence, all thinking about the way in which we should analyze decision-making under uncertainty, and we all had a slightly different language. And that's why I think one of the great things about this book is it has translated what is a universal language into English, and it's very readable. But that universal language is maths, and actually the thing about the maths is if we could get everybody thinking in terms of maths, you could get there, but there are lots of different disciplines that feel very uncomfortable with a mathematical way of doing things. So searching for a common language which isn't maths is a very important thing to do. So I think that's one of the things that comes up. You also mentioned the question about why are the cultural differences between the UK and the US, and particularly I was explaining before we came in about what I've always called the rivers of blood chart, which some of you in the room will know because that's what we call the inflation report chart, which has the projection for inflation next 2 years out, and it's red and it's kind of, you know, shades of red. That's done by them. And then, of course, very topical, we have shades of grey in the OBR report where they do the forecast for the budget deficit. Hugely important because actually, and this is something I think the Professor will be very interested in, we drive policy by a probabilistic requirement. The OBR have to say that there's a greater than 50% chance that the existing policies will deliver accordance with a fiscal mandate, which is a very grown-up way to analyse policy. Now, why is one grey and the other one red? Well, clearly the OBR is within the Treasury. As we know, the Treasury has no money for colour printing, therefore it's grey and the other one's red. What do the OBR and the Bank of England have in common compared to other areas? Answer, of course, is these are areas where we have decided to take them out of the political process and make them driven by the professionals. And, you know, in Italy, they gave Mario Monti the whole shebang, you know. That's a bit dangerous because of reasons to do with democracy. We've decided in certain areas that we are going to get technical experts to, for example, choose what the right interest rate is given a politically determined mandate on hitting an inflation target. Similarly, we decided to give to technical experts in the OBR the whole issue about forecasting and does the set of policies mean that we'll hit these mandates. So I think that's very interesting. And so the culture is, if you wanted to have more uncertainty analysis, you might want to think about that business of giving it to independent bodies. Of course, the CBO is quintessentially, as having lived in the States twice, supposed to be that independent body. And yet they've stuck with some very strange numbers. If you look back on the Treasury where I look back decades now. When we published our forecasts, you will see alongside the GDP forecast the average error over the last 10 years in that forecast. And I really think that having lived through all of this, are we going to get triple-dip recessions on a GDP number, which we know will get revised to something completely different over the next couple of years? The idea of intervals for statistics that come out, giving people a question about uncertainty would be, I think, one we should really think about. Do we do this? Uncertainty, one of the reasons that we don't do uncertainty, of course, is our wonderful media. And to give you the example, when you start off, if a company says, and you know, I bear the scars of this from being a press secretary in the Treasury and at Number 10, if a company announces that they are going to have between 50 and 500 redundancies, the headline is up to 500 redundancies at company X. That's the way it's reported. That's the way within our media it always will be reported. And that feeds back to the political decision making. So if they're given a range, they're absolutely petrified that what that means is their opponents in a very adversarial political system, and I'm sure you've managed to see our PMQs, which is obviously a completely straightforward, interesting debate about how to manage policy under uncertainty, that it gets that kind of language just grabs you, and so you get into a strange place. So my first point will be about language and the incredible certainty. Let me explain how the the certainty thing does happen and how I think economists at times can be quite difficult. There's an example in the book of the optimal income tax literature. This is very close to my heart because I was a postgrad student at Nuffield when Jim Mirrlees, who interviewed me, is probably the worst interview I've ever had in my life. It made having interviews with Tony Blair for Cabinet Secretary seem completely straightforward. Jim interviewed me to be a student at Nuffield and then taught us optimal income tax theory. He's got a Nobel Prize now in economics. Basically, the lectures were pages and pages of maths, right? They were written up. And I had a fellow student, a guy called Kevin Roberts, beside me. And he was a very good friend. And Kevin and I were sitting there during this thing on optimal income tax, as Jim was explaining the labour supply and all that, but purely equations. That I said, look, sorry, Kevin, but I'm completely lost. Kevin said, don't worry, he made a mistake just back there. So while I was busy struggling on a applied piece of econometrics on indexation and saving in Brazil, Kevin wrote 3 articles for the Review of Economic Studies, which I can safely say had no data in them whatsoever. But one of them was a comment on an article on optimal income tax, and the first line of this article in the Review of Economic Studies was, the optimal rate of income tax is in fact 57.432%. Right? It was that kind of thing, and they were playing games with this, and Jim Mirrlees would know, as the book explains, that there is a lot of uncertainty out there. But it is sometimes hard to get across this. Interestingly, the debate doesn't really want to look for it either. The OBR, when the big controversial change in lowering the top rate of tax from 50 to 45 was put out there, me, probably Richard, I don't know about anybody else, read a little bit in the OBR footnotes which talked about the impact on uncertainty and suggested to me at least that they were implying the revenue maximizing rate of income tax was somewhere between 45 and 50%. I thought, wow, that's a big, strong number. And, you know, what are the behavioral assumptions about labour supply that underlie that? And debate? No, absolutely nothing. And I think that's kind of worrying in our society, that we haven't got people who are getting out there wanting to talk about this. Now, one of the areas that I wish there'd be more of in the book is a lot of it is about how we make decisions and you know, comparing different policy options. Of course, to start that process, you need to decide, well, what is it we're trying to achieve? What is our objective function? And in the language of economics, you know, for governments, it often turns out to be a social welfare function. So we're maximizing that. And under that, we've got individuals maximizing their utility functions, subject to some budget constraints and all sorts of things. But actually defining that, what is it we are trying to achieve, and this is the book I want to write, is really hard. And if you look at what politicians will tell you about what is it, the ultimate objective, they're very woolly. If you look at, say, education, health reforms, crime, you get things like, we want to reform education and we're going to have more free schools and more academies. We want to reform the health system, so we're going to have more doctors, or we're going to change to an incentive-based system. We want to reduce crime, so we're going to have more policemen, things like that. But you know, you can see how these kinds of things get you into very bad policy areas. For example, let's take health. Now you can imagine, what's an outcome-based thing you might want to have? Well, you might want to say, let's maximize QALYs. For those, he's a very straightforward audience. You know about quality-adjusted life years. You hopefully have read Richard Layard's critique of why QALYs are a very, very bad measure. But ultimately, the idea of kind of life expectancy adjusted for quality looks like a pretty good idea as an ultimate objective. Now, when you start thinking about, in a world like that, what happens when you impose a set of sub-targets on waiting times, less than 4 hours in A&E, those sorts of things, you can imagine that hospitals get incentivized to the waiting time things, and you haven't given enough weight to the QALYs bit, and there you go, you know, you get mid-staffs and things like that. It really can be very important. So trying to get those overall objectives right is hugely important. I personally believe, and this is again something where the evidence base for this is very weak, is that we will probably do better if we start with some real discussion about what that social welfare function might be like, what it might be like in terms of, let's say, well-being as a possible measure of that, And then I think that gets you into some serious debates about, well, what's the metric for well-being? One of the things that I think economists do, and this is where I'm quite critical, and it does go back to my training with Ian Little and Jim Merlis, who didn't make this mistake, is if you look at the kind of analysis we generally do, and some of it's in this book, it's a classic cost-benefit analysis. So for the moment, forget a lot of the uncertainty and just kind of wish it away, which obviously we shouldn't. If you just did a standard cost-benefit of 3 different policy analysis, the way we do our cost-benefit, basically, should we have another airport or not, we add up the costs and the benefits, and we get measures of them in income, and we take them together, and we might work out a net present value, and we think about discounting and that sort of thing. But the implicit assumption, I'd say, is in there, is that a pound going to any individual, irrespective of their income level, is exactly the same. This is a bonkers assumption, right? We know it's not true. Diminishing marginal utility is a fact. Bill Gates will not value his extra pound as much as probably any of us in this room. Obviously, some of us are now in the private sector, and it's changed. So there are things there, and I think cost-benefit analysis is difficult. Can we get politicians to do more about outcomes? I'd like to think we could. David Cameron was very brave in saying that he realized that we weren't trying to maximize GDP, that we were thinking about trying to maximize well-being in society. And what we really need to do is now fill that in. We know we're not maximizing GDP, or we pave over the southeast. It's a daft thing to do. We know that no politician actually acts as if they're trying to do that. So why, in many of the analyses, is the only way you can really justify is that as your kind of social welfare function. And that really doesn't work for some of the reasons I've said. So I think this is really important. Then we get to the question of, how should we present this stuff? And I completely agree that point estimates are very silly things to do. It is very hard. If you take intervals, they get abused, and politicians will generally tend to basically take the midpoint of any number if you give them, which is why I think Mervyn was so passionate about having his fan charts. It's very, very hard to get midpoints, and you will get the journalists ringing up the press offices in the Bank of England saying, so where's the middle? Particularly for the GDP forecast, interestingly. And they're kind of, they want a single number. And it's very hard to get away from that. And I think that's a very, very difficult thing. When it comes to what kind of policies should we achieve, there's a very, I think, important part there that the professor makes about actually we may not be able to come up with unique answers in this. One of the things we can do is talk about policies that are dominated by other policies. So if you get to, there are a number of policies which are so bad that they are completely dominated by another policy, right? Let me give you a practical example. And the difficulty here is choosing which of the 300 we have. Winter fuel allowance, right? We know that we take money off all of you good taxpayers and we send it out to millionaires who have retired to the Costa Brava to pay for their winter fuel. This is a classic, right? It would not be hard to come up with a policy which dominates that policy. I suggest it's probably something to do with increasing the state pension would be classic. So we do have a lot of policies that actually fail that test. But there is an interesting question for policymakers in that the proposals put forward in the book come up with, so there might be a set of policies which are all, as it were, they're not dominated by anything else. And then the question is, how do you choose amongst them? And of course, the interesting question for us and for policy analysts in general is that that when you put that submission forward to the minister, it's a partial submission. What you're doing is looking at the evidence and trying to apply the principles of the civil service, of honesty, objectivity, integrity, and impartiality, which allow you to get around all those trust problems that were rightly pointed out. If we outsource this to the think tank funded by X, then surprise, surprise, I personally will be very untrustworthy of that. I think if we do go down that route, and what the route I think civil servants have to have at the minute, is taking all of this work that's done by others and analysing the biases behind it and trying to see in an objective way what comes through. Now, the politician will have that objective piece of analysis, ideally from his civil servants, but then he'll say, yes, but this submission, quite rightly, doesn't cover what is this going to do to party unity. You have given me a net present value for this, but curiously enough, the costs appear in the years 2013, 14, and early 15, and the benefits come in the latter half of 15, 16, and 17. Well, if I do this, I'll be enjoying those benefits as I sit on the opposition, saying what a great job my successor is doing. So you can see there are lots of things that, quite rightly, in our system, they will want to incorporate. And so for them, it's quite a hard role. I think what we have to do is do the best we can in these areas. Let me also say something about that's in part about the what, but the how people make decisions. And this is not just how people make decisions, but how planners, and quite often the word planners in the book, for I read politicians, who are the decision makers, make decisions. The standard economic model, which Professor Mansky talks about, is of one where you've got utility maximization with rational expectations. He regards that as I think it's fair to say, a pretty incredible model. I strongly agree with that. If you look at the assumptions that lie behind that. Now, the way I would go from this is saying, so let's try and find out how people do make decisions. And here you have the public. So how do the public respond if we say, ask them to make a decision on how much alcohol to consume, or cigarettes to smoke, or beans to buy, or whatever? How do they make those decisions? Is it in line with a standard utility maximization subject to rational expectations? I think nearly all of the evidence is no, and I'll come back to the nature of that evidence. So how are people making decisions? Now, the psychologists are doing Danny Kahneman, all of that sort of stuff. The behavioral science guys, not just economists, we must be very careful about this. The psychologists are really leading the way. It's a very rich model. It says that actually priming matters, framing matters, emotions matter. There's a big scope, and I have this dream of a world where we get a really good model of individual choice under uncertainty, which allows for all of these things. I think we would then find the utility maximization with rational expectations was an incredibly special case. And so we need that kind of work from all the others to come up with what's the right answer. I would urge people, as Danny Kahneman does in his book, to be incredibly careful about the use of the word rational. And I think Charles Mansky's in the same position. What really constitutes rational? Some people have this view as, well, it's consistent or transitive decision-making. You know, if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you should prefer A to C, or the other way around, can't remember which. And if you violate that kind of transitivity, then you're being, quotes, irrational. I think when we think about the understanding of how complex the decisions can be that people make, I think you can explain all sorts of behavior that looks, on the face of it, as irrational, as actually being, it's just that we've got a different model. So I think there's a lot there I could say more about. The interesting thing here is evidence. I think this is a really important point, because Charles Mansky makes a very, very good point that Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky went out of their way to try and find examples that violated the expected utility maximums. You know, all of their tests of the students, you know, they start them off and they go, okay, well, here's what the answer should be. Oh, look, we get a different one. So they're clearly not operating in that way. And that's what they publish. And there is a real bias in public, because if you do those tests, and surprise, surprise, reading the Ten Commandments at the start doesn't affect the degree of cheating there is in the maths test afterwards, you probably don't get it published. So there's a great bias in the literature towards publishing results. Now, the subheading that's in the book, I think, is a very good subheading. It says, you know, widespread irrationality or occasional cognitive illusions. And I think it's neither. I think what we're observing is a rich decision-making model which allows for all these other things, and we need to start understanding that decision-making model. That's where all of the behavioral work comes in. And the behavioral stuff is really important. This is the point I'll make about methods now. A lot was said there about how you do research and the fact that you can't muck around with macro. And the fact that randomized control trials, RCTs, have a number of problems in the health area, and that we should be trying to do more experimenting, policy diversification in the work we do. And let me give you a little plug for, so who does this well? And the answer is the Behavioral Insight team in the Cabinet Office. They are the classic policy diversification people at the minute. And they're not, interestingly enough, I kind of had my head in my hands when I read RCTs are not the gold standard and they go wrong badly. And also Angus Deaton was telling me about how they can go wrong when you've got some weird distributions. Actually, I think the kinds of things we've done in the Behavioral Insight team aren't subject to those particular criticisms, although I can understand in the health area why they are. If I give you one example where we've got a job centre in Leighton in Essex where you're randomly assigned either to upstairs or downstairs, and they're doing different things to you in those different areas, and they're finding out whether these things allow you to get into a job more quickly than others. And the answer is the different things we've chosen 15 to 20% better. So it's fantastic. You know, this is reducing unemployment, which is a massive cause of ill well-being. So it hits all the buttons, right? But it's an interesting example. So it's a randomized control trial. It allows policy diversification, so we can do these different things in different areas, in different places. If we're doing it just in one job centre and you either go upstairs or downstairs, you really have control for virtually everything. And it is very hard in economics to have examples where you can control for really everything. You know, I'm desperate for a kind of, I call it my Gwyneth Paltrow world of sliding doors, where I can have this, you know, suddenly say, okay, in this world, they voted in Scotland for independence, in this world they haven't, and we can just track it and see everything else the same. It's incredibly hard in social sciences to get the kind of data you'd really, really want. RCTs get you quite a long way there, but they can work for certain areas, and we should use them much more. Pilots are actually pretty poor. The interesting thing is RCTs, pilots, and a lot of the things that are in this book as ideas for how you should choose between policies. The sad thing is, quite often, as we all know in this room, we announce policies without any of this sort of work. That we are in a world of policy-generated evidence. And if you think about why that is, you think about the decision makers, the planners, the politicians. They spent a long time working to get into politics. Why do they come into politics? Because they want to make a difference. They've got strong beliefs. They start with strong priors. You know, if you want to use a Bayesian explanation of this, strong priors, and it takes a lot on the evidence side to offset those priors. And actually, if you've got strong priors, why bother about the evidence? You know, you kind of made up your mind. So it is a system that we've got that is quite hard for us to get through that. And actually, what we really need is Professor Mansky to be lecturing to politicians. And my failure was not getting him to talk to the cabinet and getting them. You know, I can imagine the kind of debate we'd have about HS2, about, you know, some of the climate change proposals. And they would come away knowing that their former certainties were anything but, I think, and that would create uncertainty in their mind. And then, I think one of the great things, and the thing we don't do enough of, is then creating the data to try and answer some of these questions. The piece the Cabinet Office put out that I like most, which actually fits in exactly with the thesis of this book, was test, learn, adapt. And that, as a way of doing policy, is hugely important. If you think about the way budgets come out and they announce a whole array of policies on housing, on you name it, they're, as it were, probably in the old world. And I think the new world, we're going to have to be in a world where we actually start to think about creating the kind of data which allow us to decide what's the right policy. And if you look at the things that have been done in the behaviour change unit, we've tried 5 or 6 different tax letters to different people that owe us money, and in the end, come up with the one that works. We've tested, we've learnt from that, and we've applied all the way through. So, just remains for me to say buy the book. I know we've got a big deficit, but actually this will save you vast amounts of money. That's the way to sell it to your ministers. It will create better policies which actually have better outcomes. And I'm really strongly in favour of what the professor, his definition of what makes good decision-making is looking at what it does in terms of outcomes. And a good decision-making process has good outcomes. And that is something we should all be striving for. Thank you.
It's great to hear this strong support for research in economics and models of decision-making, which of course is one of the things we do. But we have a roving mic, I think, don't we? So if there are any questions, please post them now. One at the front here, one there.
Lord, if I may a little deeper inquire about the formulation of assumptions plus data gives you conclusions, because I don't want to question that, but ask rather, isn't it the case that the relevant assumptions are not merely confined to the advisors and the policy and to the analysts, but also to the policy makers, because the assumptions that they make influence which experts and analysts they go to. Let me give you an example. I work on food and health policy. There's a question about the use of emulsifiers in our food supply. The standard assumption is, we'll permit emulsifiers if they're safe. Are they safe? Let's ask toxicologists. And toxicologists are relevant, but they might not be the only relevant group. Increasingly recently, it seems to me that because emulsifiers keep large amounts of oils and fats in suspension, they're contributing to the increasing load of oils and fats in our diet, and they're thereby contributing to the rising incidence of obesity. This impact on public health and nutrition is not on the policymakers' agenda. Nutritionists don't get asked, and therefore there's a narrow focus on one narrow area of expertise, and then those experts themselves make a separate set of assumptions, so that if the rats and mice studies give them the answers they want, they believe them, and if not, they discount them. But aren't there two sets of assumptions, both in the analysts and in the policymakers?
Yes, it's a question of how many levels of meta we want to go up here. I think we can talk about policy making as the caring about final outcomes, and then we can care about how the policy analysis is actually done, which is what I was talking about. And if I interpret you correctly, you're talking about who gets chosen to be the policy analyst in the first place, which is like another level up. And that if you don't ask the right people, then you're not going to get the right expertise. And so that's, other than agreeing with you that that's but certainly, yeah.
There's a question here.
Also impose a terrible burden on the electorate, because they don't know whether the politician is giving the truth or whether it's a brash. So it doesn't really, what is the point of democracy if the electorate cannot judge what our politicians are saying?
You know, there's always a problem whenever I speak that the audience and myself goes out in some kind of existential funk, I guess I could put it that way, as to what in the world can we do. To be somewhat more optimistic, I think that there are social norms that society sets on how things are done. And I think we're in where Gus and I were talking about this before, is a kind of a bad equilibrium, where you can't trust anything and you don't know how people can interpret it. But I think one can move from a bad equilibrium to a good equilibrium if it became the norm for the public to be skeptical and not to take things at face value, and to expect that their political leaders would tell the truth and express their uncertainty. Then maybe that could become the norm in a democracy. And there are, just to give me one very mundane example to show that this is not impossible. It's not on a policy-making matter, but the weather in London has been miserable, right? And it's been equally miserable in the United States now. So we all pay attention to the weather forecast. Look at how the weather forecasts are done. We've all become accustomed to have a probability of rain in the next day. And no one fusses about that. That's the standard way it's done. Now, that actually required a change in norms to start doing probability of rain. Now, we don't do that with temperature. We say that, high temperature will be +3 or something like that. But we do that with probability of rain. Everyone becomes comfortable with it. And I think that may be possible, to actually change this, the social norms and then have the public want more transparency and clarity, and then maybe things will be better. Maybe this is totally naive. Sorry, I know he's shaking his head, it's naive.
Can I add to that, just having lived in the States and the UK a lot, you're slightly ahead of us. They've been using probability of precipitation for a very long time. It's a kind of standard thing and everyone talks about it. It's still not standard, I'm afraid, here. So, but the one thing I'd say about the truth is we do have some truth police around the system. So when it comes to the budget, Richard Mundell, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, comes out and says, actually, this turns out not to be true, or that. And the Office Budget and Responsibility did, in fact, have a go at the Prime Minister recently and said actually something he said in a speech wasn't correct, and I wanted that corrected. We have the Statistics Authority, which has an obligation, which I hope it pushes now. Sometimes I had problems with them when I was in government, but obviously where you sit depends on how you see it. But I think we do need those sorts of things. I personally have this dream where we have question time, where the various people, and this has nothing to do with the parties, this is every single one of the panel, you just want someone up there in the truth box to say, actually that may have got a really big round of applause, but it's completely untrue. And that, I'm afraid, the quality of the applause and the untruth often go together. So but more seriously, I think there are systems whereby in our society we need to encourage those people to tell the truth, and those bodies who are respected and trusted. If you look at the degree of trust, politicians down there in the 20s, there are lots of professional groups who are much more highly trusted, and politicians know that, which is why we need independent experts, professional experts, to get their voice and be heard.
Thank you. There was a question here, and then there was one over there, so we need a microphone here. Thank you.
Society, and what the role and opportunities of natural experiments in adaptive diversification and policy research, particularly where randomized controlled trials are either impractical or unethical.
I mentioned the diversification by decentralization. Using that is one version of that, of decentralizing. It's not a full randomized trial. It's not that every state in the United States randomly chooses their abortion policy, for example, which is under some ferment right now, or their death penalty policy, which is there's variation across states. But there is variation that occurs naturally, and you have to worry because it's self-selected, but you can still learn some things from that. And so that kind of geographic diversification is one way. The other way I talk about is diversification. I call it diversification by cohort. That because of the equal treatment of equals, you may not be able to differentially use different treatments for different patients at the same time, but maybe from year to year you can change things. And for people who are patients in 1 year, do it the one way, and in another year, do it another way. So there are a variety of things of that sort. In the book, there's a kind of an extended proposal for changing the way the Food and Drug Administration does drug approval, which would allow kind of a limited licensing of drugs. Right now, it's an up or down decision. Either a drug is approved or not. And I have this proposal for what I call adaptive partial drug approval, where they allow to put some of the drug on market. And that was also a kind of a pragmatic implementation of the diversification without the kind of the pure social planning view. So I think there's a lot of scope for thinking about these things in ways that might be feasible in a democracy and would yield something useful.
There's a strong backlash from politicians against RCTs, as it were, and it is quite difficult. We've managed to get them in on relatively small things. When you start to do them big things, even some of our best ministers, I've had problems with them saying, I can't explain this to my constituents, why some people are getting this and some people aren't. And that's a real challenge, I think.
Yes. Thank you. There's a question here.
I wanted to make you talk about the problem of adaptive policy making with the adversarial nature of policies, especially when the adaptive approach may suggest changes of policy and even U-turns. So I don't know what the tensions are there and how you resolve them.
It's mentioned very briefly in this book, but I've actually done some technical work on this, on kind of extreme adversarial position of bilateral negotiation. The example I use when I did this was of a union labor negotiation or on standards for teachers. I used an example in New York City where there was a standard seniority and no merit pay and so on, and the New York City School District wanted to introduce some kind of incentives for better performance, and of course the union.
It was posed as all or nothing. You're either going to have the current policy with no merit pay or move entirely to the new policy where it's all merit pay. Then the two sides will be off to the corner and they'll never agree on anything.
But if you thought about it in this diversification idea, that maybe we'll randomly select some teachers to be subject to merit pay and some subject to the old idea, then I actually worked this out. There's a theorem on this, which I don't want to give you, but you actually work out formally that maybe you could reach an agreement between the two sides, in a very strongly adversarial system where they might agree to allow some degree of the innovation. And the reason why they both may do it is because they both may have uncertainty. And even though they have different objectives, they still have some uncertainty, and both may want to learn. So I think there are some possibilities.
The way I would say you can get to it as well, a slightly different way, is to say, if you've specified, let's take the education example, that you actually want to improve certain educational outcomes, and that's your high-level thing, then you try these different things. If it turns out that your policy is not working, it's not producing the better outcomes, you better change it, because you're going to be found out, because the results are going to come out. So you can create incentives within the structure to say, actually, we're not committed to this particular sort of thing or that particular thing. What we're committed to is this big thing of improving educational outcomes. And we've tried this, didn't quite work, so we're going to move somewhere else. Now, that's somewhat naive in our political system that you can do that smoothly, but actually the alternative to a policy U-turn is generally carrying on with a policy that isn't working. So neither outcome's that great. So convincing people that actually moving to a better thing and not selling your original policy too hard in the first place is probably part of that.
Last question, I think, since we have up to 5 minutes left.
Just in the, what was it, the laboratories of whatever, approach to democracy, the life to democracy in America and the States. But obviously, states themselves are political entities. Doesn't happen across the which could do something similar political entities. To what extent do those entities have an interest and a willingness to create the sort of data that will allow centrally learning from their different experiences?
One of the things that I do talk about in the book is that each state on its own may not feel that it has that incentive, but the federal government as a whole should think that there's an incentive for the states to produce the data so that other states can learn from it. And I give an example. It's one of the few positive examples I can think of in recent American history. But in the 1980s, there was a lot of debate about welfare policy towards poverty populations. And under the first Bush administration, like 1988, 1989, 90, so on, the Department of Health and Human Services granted many waivers to the AFDC, Aid for Families and Dependent Children program, and let each state do things their own way, with the explicit desire that the country as a whole would learn from it. And it was part of the deal. This was very forward-thinking, and I haven't seen it replicated since then, is that to get a waiver and to implement your own version of welfare policy, you had to agree to certain kinds of data collection. You had to agree to certain kinds of randomized experiments and so on, and to commissioning an evaluation to see how the thing worked out. And it was what I was at the time. I was the director of the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin, so I got to see some of this firsthand. And I thought it was a wonderful example. Unfortunately, I don't know of a more recent version of that. But I think that's the way to do it. Is that at the federal level, you can internalize the externalities and give the states the incentive to provide the information.
Well, thank you very much. It just remains for me to thank you for coming tonight and for your comments, and to invite you to join us and ask some more questions perhaps outside where we have a short reception, and to thank Gus O'Donnell for his insights and perceptive comments, and particularly to thank Chuck for coming here and telling us about this work. He will be back next March. I have absolutely certain that this will happen because I've seen it happen for 12 years in a row, and maybe we can then organise another lecture at which we can have some of the politicians on the side and see what they have to say. Thank you very much indeed.